There is an episode on my podcast where I talk about this, about how when you go for research adjacent jobs, often you're being scored. So it might be that there is a line in the job description that says like excellent communication skills. And if you just say, I have excellent communication skills, that might get you like a 1. But what's going to get you like a 5 is if you say, when I was doing my PhD, I organised an outreach project for some local school children, and we did these things, and this was the outcome of doing that. And whether you need it for the job application or whether you need it for the interview, when you go for research adjacent jobs, it's all about give an example of a time when you have helped to be part of a team to make something happen. Give an example of a time when you've dealt with like a really challenging situation. And it's looking for those really concrete examples. Then nobody's going to ask about your qualifications again. They're not interested. They don't particularly want to hear about your research either, unless you can tell, again, a really compelling story about how you demonstrated some of these skills through the research or through how you shared the research or dealt with a challenging situation that came up during the research. So yes, incredibly important to do that.
Welcome to Beyond the Thesis with Papa PhD, your weekly inspiration for post-PhD career development. With me, David Mendes. Welcome to this special episode of Beyond the Thesis with Papa PhD. This is a two-sided episode, and you'll see what this means as we talk. Today, I have the great pleasure of having with me Sarah McClusky of the Research Adjacent podcast. Sarah McClusky is a freelance consultant, trainer and facilitator specializing in research events and communication. Sarah launched the Research Adjacent podcast in 2023, and it's a podcast celebrating all the amazing people who go into making research successful, not just researchers. In the podcast, Sarah shares her career stories and strategies to help people thrive in their research adjacent careers. And she has been herself research adjacent for over 20 years. She has worked for universities and research projects, science centers and museums, learned societies and education providers. Sarah's academic background is in plant pathology and biochemistry, but she has worked across a huge range of disciplines, including all the sciences plus the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Sarah McClusky, welcome to Beyond the Thesis with Papa PhD.
Oh, thank you very much for that welcome. It makes it sound like I've really been round the houses, but I've been at this stuff for a long time now. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So, Sarah, research adjacent, I love the name of the podcast. I'm super happy to have you here today because I think this research adjacent space is somewhat opaque to a lot of people, especially people just coming out of graduate school.
Yeah.
And the people I have talked with who are now like in research adjacent jobs have kind of found about it, often serendipitously or in very convoluted ways with a lot of randomness and not too much of a linear path towards it. You know, of course, like thinking of myself, I got into the PhD thinking of teaching and doing research. And then, you know, no one ever presented me all the careers that could come after the PhD, including this research adjacent space. Can you talk a little bit about it and share how that space caught your interest and led you to starting the podcast?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing to say about it is that if people have never heard about research adjacent space before, partly because I made it up. So that's, it's not like a term that, I mean, as you said, you like the name. And it's partly because I found myself, the name came from, I was organising a careers panel and for PhD students and early career postdocs. And they wanted people who were doing jobs that were not in academia. And so I had to come up with a name for the careers panel. And the name, I just was out for a walk one day. It's how these things happen, isn't it? It kind of popped into my head. I was like, research adjacent, it's good. So we'll call it that. So I called the careers panel that. And then actually I was just like, this name is too good. I have to do something with this name. And it really fitted in with a bit of a passion that I had at the time, which I guess is kind of, there's a bit of a story there. So I've been doing these jobs without having a name for them for about 25 years now. So as you say, I did do a PhD. I did my PhD in the late 90s. And I was one of those people I did very well in my undergrad, and everybody said I should do a PhD. So I did a PhD without really giving it much thought and without really having much of a career plan in mind. My supervisor could probably see I was never really destined to be an academic, because whilst I was doing my PhD, I got sent on lots of courses. So to do things like, media training and science writing and things like that. And the world was slightly different then. And so when I came out of my PhD, there was also the tricky thing that I did an interdisciplinary PhD before it was fashionable. They're very fashionable now. Yeah. They were not fashionable in the 90s. I was also doing a form of biochemistry, but it's biological chemistry really, which again, natural products and things like that, which was not fashionable in the 90s. It was all genetics. So when I came out of my PhD, I had that experience I think a lot of people do. I hadn't finished writing up. I'd run out of money. I had to go and get some jobs to keep me ticking along and wrote my PhD on the weekends. The jobs that came up, I had done a lot of work in customer service roles as I was studying. I had done a bit of event management stuff for the Students' Union. So I had some of these skills to draw on. And that combination of kind of customer service, event management, science, communication, I ended up going into science centres and working in science centres, and started off on, minimum wage, just enough to pay the bills and get me through whilst I was writing up my thesis. And at that point, I still thought maybe I would go and do something in academia. But actually, I reached a bit of a crossroads where in the same week, I was offered a fast track job interview at AstraZeneca, big biotech company. Yeah. And I was offered a full-time education, science communication job. Oh, and for, this is how we make decisions sometimes. And the science education job was in the north of England, and I'm from Scotland. If people might be able to tell if my accent might not, I'm from Scotland. The job was in the north of England. The biotech company job was in the south of England, and I wanted to stay nearer home. So I took the education job without really giving it much thought. But actually, that's still what I'm doing now, 25 years later. It's gone through various kind of guises, but still in that form. And I think what I would say is, so I never originally aspired to go into this kind of work. And the reason, as you said, that people maybe haven't heard of it, it's because a lot of these jobs didn't exist. So a lot of them are really new. Even 25 years ago when I was coming out of my PhD, only just then was science communication becoming a job. And at that point, there were no master's courses and things like that there are in it now. I was very lucky in the point that I was coming into it is that they were desperate for anybody who could do some of this stuff because it was exploding. So it got me a foot in the door at that point. But a lot of the jobs that there are now and the sorts of things that people that I have on guest on Research Adjacent, they're jobs that have, on some degree, some of them have existed for a long time, like research management jobs, but some of them are very recent jobs. Like in the UK, there's a lot of stuff around research impact and knowledge exchange. Those jobs have only really existed for maybe 10 years. And that will be why people haven't heard of them. And they also, again, it's that thing that when people are in, and I know you've talked about this in previous episodes, when people are in that academic space, all they see around them are other academics. So they don't necessarily get that sense of what else might be out there. So really what led me down to start the Research Adjacent podcast was partly because I wanted to help people who were coming out. I was working a lot with PhD students who were coming to the end of their studies and were just so lost in terms of what they wanted to do next. And they could see that there were no jobs, particularly in the arts and humanities at that point in time. They could see that there was a real shortage of jobs. And I was on recruitment panels where we would get like 50 applicants for one job. And I wanted to do something which would help people like that and help them see that they had options and that they were hugely employable, and that knowledge of research could be really valuable in different roles. So partly there was that side of things and that real desire to help. The other thing was I had a little bit of a bee in my bonnet, and that is because these research adjacent jobs make a phenomenal contribution to research actually happening and being successful and getting out in the world and having an impact. But they don't get credit, and they don't get their names on papers, and they don't get career progression the same way. There's no such thing as like tenure track or whatever for people in these research adjacent roles. And so they're just not getting credit in the same way. And I thought, what can I do to help shine a spotlight on these people and the incredible work that they do? And that's what led me to start the Research Adjacent podcast.
It's an amazing story. And it's funny how it kind of aligns with the evolution also of the space. Because a lot of these things now, like I said, science communication or even science illustration now, there's master's courses around that. In my conversations on and off the podcast with people who are post-PhD and doing different things, I have talked with people in the university contributing to, like you said, the research in different ways. So some of them helping the researchers with their grant writing, some of them with getting the science and the discoveries to go outside the walls of the university and to get talked about in news or on different platforms. And also, there's people who are working in policy. It can be at the level of the university, but also in someone in the States who's actually working at the federal level in terms of university policy. And these are all people who love staying abreast of what's happening in research, but who no longer are at the lab. And while I was in graduate school, like you said, I never heard of them. For me, it was the graduate students, the lab technicians, the postdocs, the PI, and that's what makes university. And then I discover that there's a host of people who are really working their ass off to get the grants funded. So a host of people who are passionate about science, passionate about research, but who chose to not go the way of actually being a PI and being a researcher, etc., but to contribute in a different way. And so can you please, for the people who are listening and who think, oh, this actually could be interesting for me because I do want to stay close to academia. You mentioned research managers and you mentioned science communication type offices. What other job descriptions or job names that people don't know about that could be really good fits for them?
Yeah, there's so much out there. And I think even when I started the podcast, I don't think I'd quite got my head around how much was out there. I tend to think of these roles in two camps. There's the jobs that are involved in making research happen. So that might be the research managers and administrators. That might be people who work on grant funding and things like that. It might even be people who do support roles like technicians or looking after people who work in the library, people who are doing software, things like that, and looking after health and safety, all that sort of stuff that helps the research to get done on that kind of practical role, that sort of internal sense. And then there's all the roles which are about taking research out into the world. And that includes the communication type roles that we've talked about, which is certainly the route I started through. And I know that's the route that you've come through as well. But there are policy jobs, as you've mentioned. There are people who work in what in the UK we call impact, but that can be around building partnerships with people who are outside of the research organisation. It's not just about universities as well. And so there's people involved in doing partnerships. There might be people helping industrial relationships for university spin-out companies and startups and things like that. So there's all those people that are involved in making research happen. And I mean, I've had people in the podcast, things like people who are lawyers who work on intellectual property, people who are exhibition designers who make exhibitions that are based on research. I've had people who work in archives and museums. Just the range of roles is absolutely vast. and there's something for everybody depending on what it is that they're interested in. And then, as I say, the other thing that's really interesting as well is that these jobs are not just in universities. So they are also in places like government. So as you said, the kind of policy jobs, library, information services, all that kind of stuff in the UK. We've got some civil service research organisations. There's places like what we call DEFRA, but it's like agriculture agencies and environment agencies and things like that. There's people working there. There are charities, particularly medical charities, that have people involved in research, communication type roles, also in funding roles, all sorts of stuff. So museums, local councils, it's not just about higher education. And I think that's another thing that's really interesting. And the thing about all these roles is that having an understanding of the research, an understanding of the process of how research works can be really, really helpful. It's by no means essential. And I would say that about 50% of the people that I interview on my podcast don't have PhDs, but about 50% of them do. And having that knowledge of research can help you to understand the process and get up to speed very quickly. And I've often seen people with PhDs get promoted very quickly in these roles, even if they have to start kind of at the entry level if it's something that's a bit new to them. So yeah, that's an overview of everything that's out there.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I was going to ask you a question that you ended up answering, which was where do PhDs fit and why? And you just said it. But now you just finished with something that it's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people, but it's very important, which is because there is no straight path. Maybe, 10, 20, 30 years from now, there'll be more like bridges built from the PhD to specific spaces in the different ecosystems. But today, because these bridges don't happen, you as a PhD need to advocate for yourself. You need to learn how to talk with these people. My take is that the best way to learn is to, before you're looking for a job, talk with people who are doing those things and learn and hear how they talk and hear what terms they use. But today, especially if you're going into a position that's brand new, maybe a position where, or a place where PhDs are not traditionally hired.
Yeah.
One of the things that will happen is that the pay for that first job will probably not reach what you had envisioned for yourself at the end of the degree. Thinking, now I have this degree, it's the best degree, so now I can make this much per year and da 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 da.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this question, and like I said, it's often depending on the personality of the candidates, it can be a hard pill to swallow of starting at an entry level and then evolving.
Yeah.
Do you have more reflections on that and how to navigate that and how to have those conversations in a way that actually leads you to a good outcome and to not exclude yourself? Because what people do is like, oh, this is too low. And then they are maybe losing a great opportunity because they would then evolve quickly.
Yes, I think that's it. So, it can be, as you say, a bitter pill to swallow. But if you're looking at these things, you need to look at it, even though there might be research in the job title. So say it's like a research manager job. Just because it's got research manager job in it, you might know the research bit. That doesn't mean you know the manager bit. And I think it's really important to separate those things and recognize that PhD students, PhD graduates have got incredible transferable skills, but you need to learn how to transfer them. And you need to learn how to take those skills and use them in a different setting. And sometimes I would say to people is like, which of these things would you prefer? Hanging around for a year, applying for jobs and not getting anywhere, or maybe going into a job at a lower grade, but that you can get experience, you can get to know people, you can get a foot in the door, and you will get promoted quickly. And certainly, when I finished my PhD, I couldn't afford not to. So my first jobs out of my PhD were pretty much minimum wage. But I got a foot in the door, I got experience, I got promoted very quickly. And so sometimes swallowing your pride, going into it, this advice I give with anything, PhD graduates one of the main skills you've got is curiosity, because that's what led you into doing a PhD in the first place. And I think it's always encouraging people of how you can approach your career path with a bit of curiosity and think about what can I learn in any situation. I did voluntary work as well to get experience when I was coming out of my PhD. You can learn something from every opportunity if you go into it with an open mind. But I always will counsel people, you probably will have to start at a lower level, but you'll probably get promoted quickly. But you can get promoted to kind of similar levels. So just to keep it in the university, if that's what's familiar to people, a project manager role, like a research project manager, will probably be paid about the same as a research assistant. Then a research manager is probably similar to an assistant professor. And then once you can get up to kind of, heads of units and things like that, and then you'll be starting to get paid at the same level as a professor. So there's opportunities. It doesn't mean that you're destined to be on minimum wage forever, but you have to go through the process and demonstrate your skills. And it's because, I know this is something you talk about a lot on your podcast as well, is I have had people, I've done a lot of recruitment, I've been on a lot of recruitment panels, and you get people who apply with a PhD just assuming that the PhD is enough and that I'm somehow going to know, look, I managed a PhD project, so therefore I can manage this project. But it's up to you, up to the candidate to show that, to demonstrate, to think about the examples of how they can demonstrate their project management skills. And it's not as straightforward as just, here's my PhD certificate, give me a job. It's still thinking about how you transfer those skills over. And really thinking about those transferable skills is how people will find the right niche for them. Because as I said, this is a huge area of work where having the research knowledge is really valuable, but you might have amazing communication skills, might be your special thing. So you might look at the research communication side of things. It may be that you're great on the financial side of things. So maybe you look at research funding or finance management. It may be that you're really good at connecting people and building partnerships. So then you think, right, I'm going to look at knowledge exchange roles and policy roles where there's lots of partnership working. So I think it's really important to do a bit of an inventory of like, what am I really good at? A, what am I really good at? And B, what do I really enjoy beyond just this subject matter that you've been studying for the last 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah, and I'd say once you've done that work of telling all of that, to try to find 1 or 2 stories from your graduate school journey that illustrate that. Because some people, you'll just say that and it'll still not be enough. They'll want to see, okay, but what does that look like in real life? You have a story to illustrate that. That's the next step is look back and think, how can I demonstrate that I'm really good at connecting people? If you want to talk about a transferable skill, you cannot just name it. You need to illustrate it through some story, some narrative. Yeah. And so, actually, so when I was in my postdoc, I had this budget with which I had objectives. I ended up reaching my objectives at 70% budget.
Definitely.
Do some more effort in making tangible how you did those things that you're saying you did.
There is an episode on my podcast where I talk about this, about how when you go for research adjacent jobs, often you're being scored. So often your application is being literally marked out of whatever, depending on what they're looking for. And that's exactly what they look like. So it might be that there is a line in job description that says excellent communication skills. If you just say, I have excellent communication skills, that might get you like a 1. But what's going to get you a 5 is if you say, when I was doing my PhD, I organised an outreach project for some local school children, and we did these things, and this was the outcome of doing that. And then it'd be like, oh yeah, actually, they've demonstrated their communication skills there, and then you would get a higher mark if you give that example of how you've done it. And whether you need it for the job application or whether you need it for the interview, when you go for research adjacent jobs, it's all about that. So it's all about give an example of a time when you have helped to be part of a team to make something happen. give an example of a time when you've dealt with a really challenging situation. And it's looking for those really concrete examples. Nobody, once you get, maybe on the list, it might say, oh, you need a degree, but that would just be like, tick, whatever. Then nobody's going to ask about your qualifications again. They're not interested. They don't particularly want to hear about your research either, unless you can tell, again, a really compelling story about how you demonstrated some of these skills through the research or through how you dealt with a challenging situation that came up during the research. So that's incredibly important to do that.
And it applies to first, I would say it's important even for people in academia, but it gets more and more important because of the distance and the culture mismatch. The less adjacent you are, the more you go into industry, etc.
Yeah.
You really need to do more of that work.
Definitely.
And do more effort retelling or learning how to tell that story.
Yeah.
Sarah, we have a few minutes left. I have one more question for you. I know of your podcast, but people who are listening maybe don't. So I'd really like you to take a couple of minutes saying where people can find you, be it on LinkedIn, etc., but also your podcast and all the other places you're at, so that they can explore research adjacent and learn more about you and what motivates you, but also what they can learn from you and how you can help them if they.
Yeah, absolutely. So the podcast is Research Adjacent. You'll find it on any podcast app. If you just search Research Adjacent, you will find it. The website is researchadjacent.com, and that's where you will find all the back catalogue and things like that. And now the back catalogue is getting quite sizable. So there is a little quiz on the website as well, which is if you go to researchadjacent.com/quiz, and you can answer some questions about things like your transferable skills, what you're interested in, and it will give you some suggestions of certain podcasts that might be interesting for you. And it also will help to potentially narrow down the areas of research adjacent work that you might be interested in. So that's a really good place to go and check out if people are just not sure where to start, if it's all a bit much. All of the people who have guested on the podcast will be really happy when you say about reaching out to people who've done it before. Everybody who's been on the podcast will be really happy for people to get in touch with them, ask questions about their job and find out a bit more. So if there is something that piques your interest, then definitely go and connect with them. And the same goes for me as well. I'm really happy to help people in any way I can. The main place I hang out is on LinkedIn. So it's Sarah McClusky. The main tricky thing is to get the right spelling of my surname, which is McLusky. And then you will track me down on LinkedIn and come and connect and say hello there. That would be fantastic.
So with all your experience in the space and with the podcast and these conversations, I'm always interested in my guests' reflections about key transferable skills for the years to come. Your job didn't exist when you started it back then, when you finished a PhD. And again, today, people who are in graduate school, very probably the exact job they're going to do in 3, 4, or 5 years is not something that exists yet in that complete form. Maybe there's something that's kind of emerging towards that. But so also key or important or valued transferable skills also evolve.
Definitely. There's a lot of people in the research adjacent world at the moment a little bit nervous about AI, particularly when it comes to things like, writing and so on. Maybe I'm in denial, but I'm not hugely worried about it. But as you say, thinking about it from that point of view is what are the skills that are going to endure? And I think the main things I would say, particularly from life and research adjacent, curiosity is the number one thing. And it relates to other things like growth mindset and so on. But always trying to go into a situation and just thinking, what can I learn here? And even when it's a challenging situation, I'm just thinking about what's the lesson, what can I learn, what can I get out of it? So I think that is an incredibly valuable skill to cultivate. Also, just flexibility, which I think is really important. A lot of people in the research adjacent world do jobs where they do a bit of everything. So being willing to get stuck in, give it a go, being flexible, being willing to maybe try something and have it not work out the first time, but just giving it a go. As you said, we both started podcasts pretty much that way. It's just like, let's see what we can learn from it. Let's just give it a go and see what happens, and we'll learn as we go. So I think that curiosity and flexibility are probably the biggest ones. A huge number of research adjacent roles are really about people. So they might on the surface be about doing grant applications or something like that. But at the end of the day, it's about how do you convince somebody? How do you tell a story that's compelling to another person? How do you help to support somebody through that journey? How do you build those partnerships that are going to be essential? And I think those interpersonal skills are incredibly important, because also as we do see this increase in AI, what's going to be more and more important at work is people and how we interact with each other. So I think that that's the other one that I would say is really important.
I love it. So curiosity, flexibility, and people, interpersonal skills. I love these three. I think they're a great way to close this conversation, to end this part of the interview. Sarah, thank you so much. It's been great. I love your story. I love the way you put your energy into your work, and the passion is clear. And I really appreciate having had the opportunity to chat with you in this special two-sided episode.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been an honor. It's been really fun. Thank you.
Hi there. If you have questions and doubts about your professional future as a young scientist, as a PhD, you can now talk directly to me by joining the Beyond the Thesis community on school.com. If you go to skool.com/papaphd, you will find a safe space and a community of people like you figuring out their postgraduate school career journey. And you will have ample opportunity to talk with me directly and ask me your questions on live coffee time sessions and on weekly Q&As. Additionally, you will find courses and also have the opportunity of having one-on-one calls with me. So remember, skool.com/papaphd. See you soon.
Welcome along to the Research Adjacent podcast, David. It's fantastic to have you here. I wonder if we could begin by hearing a bit about who you are and what you do.
So, my name is David Mendes. One of the reasons I'm here today is because both of us are academic ecosystem podcasters. I've been now almost for 6 years running the Beyond the Thesis with Papa PhD podcast. On that side of things, I'm part of this great community of people who are trying to give back to the academic community. We've been part of it. We went through graduate school, and we're trying to share whatever we have done, learned in our post-academic or post-PhD journey, sometimes academic too. For me, it's really been about hearing. I've done almost 300 interviews with people such as you, but a lot of other people about their post-PhD journey. And it's about getting young researchers to tune up a little bit how they tell the story of what they did, so that it allows them to have quicker and better outcomes professionally after they get their degree. Be it to become a professor, but we know that's 1/5 of people who can go that path, but especially the other ones who need to transition to different professional ecosystems where they'll have to advocate for themselves and learn a new culture, a new language, etc. So it's trying to help them, to mentor them and coach them to do that. Then the other side of what I do, it has to do with what I've done professionally even before starting the podcast. And that has been, so the space where I've been developing my work has been medical communication. So medical writing and translation, and always in the scientific medical domain. And if we go a little bit back, my PhD was in cell biology. Yeah. I have a PhD from the University of Coimbra in Portugal. The lab work was all done here in Montreal, where I ended up staying at the Montreal Neurological Institute. And before that, so I did my undergrad and master's in Portugal in genetics and microbiology. My path was not linear. I didn't go straight from the master's to the PhD. It's interesting to look back and make sense of how things happened, even though a lot of them were serendipitous.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love most about this podcast is often people comment on that it's, I'm giving them an opportunity to almost look back and make sense of the path that they've gone on. So a PhD in cell biology, then you got, I'm imagining it wasn't straight into doing this medical communications work. How did that come about? Why was that an area that interested you?
That's a great question, because these days I have been talking directly to graduate students a lot about networking and the importance of it for them, even while they are in graduate school. And when I finished, and in my presentation, I show this kind of image. I don't know if you've been if you've been to like cornfield maze. I don't know if it's...
Yes, I know what you mean. They sometimes call them a maze here.
A maze,
yes.
maze squared. So I had been to one in the fall. All the corn was brown and kind of gloomy in a certain way, kind of Halloween-esque. And I had filmed that, and I used it in my presentation because it kind of looks like a little bit scary and lost. And I was lost. I hadn't built up any social capital outside my close network of people in the lab, maybe the institute, but no further than that. And then my friends, family, etc. And actually my first job, while I was floundering to understand what was going to happen, actually came through friends and family. So the mother-in-law of my partner's friend actually needed people with my profile to do distance education tutoring for people who needed to kind of complement their secondary school curriculum with, I don't know, chemistry, physics. You know, it was always science related.
Yes,
and it's people who wanted to do medical degrees, no, not MD, but nursing or something related more to health.
Allied health stuff.
Yeah. And so I did this almost a year, not full time, something I had done before. It's something I enjoyed. But the thing is, this was not a full-time job. But the cool thing about this story was it came totally out of the blue. My partner says, hey, by the way, my friend says that her mother-in-law needs someone like you. I was like, okay, that's interesting. So the point of that story is that, when we talk of networking, it often scares people because, I have to go buy a suit and go to this event and And sometimes networking happens organically in the network that you already have that's not even related to academia, because you never know whether this person knows someone who might actually have an opportunity for you. So that was the first job.
Yeah.
But because it didn't, it ended up not filling up my schedule, I kept looking. And then I was more like intentional, and I went back to my institute where I had done the lab. There I noticed some people weren't there anymore, and I started asking, where are they? And thinking, they probably, masters went to PhD or PhD went to postdoc. And two of them had gone to work in this domain that I had never heard of, which was called medical writing. And so then it was really just a question of, okay, well, I'm not a very extroverted person, but I still said, this sounds interesting. I've always liked languages. Communicating science is always something, was part of the process of graduate school that I always liked. I particularly liked creating figures. Mm-hmm. But anyway, there was something there that piqued my curiosity. And then talking with these two people who actually were at the same employer, I saw, okay, this has potential. And they said, if you are interested, there's a kind of an internal referral program. Let's look at your CV, tailor it, and I can pass it on.
Yeah,
and
that's really
the rest
helpful.
is, And then I actually spent almost 5 years at that company, going from junior to senior medical writer.
Yeah. And it's, as you say, it's amazing how sometimes just these connections and networks and people that, just opportunities come up, and however much you plan out your career, however much you think you know where you're going to go, there's always something that comes up just out of left field. And you just go, all right, okay, let's do that. I mean, there's people I've interviewed on the podcast, who've ended up in a certain career just because there was a bus that went in that direction. So they looked at what employers there were along that bus route, and that sort of thing. And you just end up where you end up. It's fascinating. But as you say about networking, I've had Jenny Smith, previous guest on this podcast, a couple of episodes that are worth going back to if people are interested on networking. She's got some fantastic tips there about how, as you say, it's not about going to some stuffy event and, making awkward conversation. There's lots of different ways of approaching networking. So you found yourself in this medical writing field, getting really established there. What was it that made you want to come back and start sharing stories of people in their post-PhD journey? What made you want to start the podcast?
So part of also actually what was actually the starting point of this reflection that led to starting Beyond the Thesis in 2019. Once I was kind of, like you said, starting to be established in that medical writing space, I started being invited here in Montreal to different career events, career panels, and then hearing the questions of current graduate students. And this would be like 3 years after my PhD, 5, 10 years after my PhD. And understanding that some of the issues that I had by the end of my PhD, the end was like not super pleasant in different ways, like monetary wise. And anyway, there were different things like technical difficulties in my experiment that led me to have a tough time of the last year or so. And then also to be writing while I was doing that tutoring work that I mentioned, etc., and then defending eventually after. But so 2 things happened. First, I understood, okay, these things that I was like putting on myself or blaming myself for at the end of my PhD, that, and that feeling of, okay, I got into the PhD because I wanted to teach. I got into the PhD because I love being in the lab and doing research, and now I'm leaving academia. And there's a feeling of maybe failure to a certain extent that I had and thought belonged just to me, and also of leaving the tribe that you were working to be part of all these years. And when you get to the PhD, it's been a bunch of years. But seeing that the doubts, the difficulties that I had were then echoed by 1, 2, 10, 20 people each time I was going to a career event, first maybe kind of rethink the self-blame mindset that I was in and take kind of some distance from it. That's where the genesis of the idea of the podcast comes. Eventually, at a certain moment, I had this opportunity. I had the material because I had a good mic. I had material to do that. And I had friends from the lab who were now not going for postdocs, but starting their startups or being science communicators. And I thought, if I share these stories, people who are in this doubt, in this fog of the end of the PhD, not knowing what comes after and being anxious, there's nothing better than hearing the story of someone who navigated that and actually came out on the other side happy and is fulfilled. There's nothing better than that to help lower this anxiety and these negative feelings. And so, that was it in 2019. I had more time at a certain period. I saw I think it was an article on Facebook saying why you should start your podcast in 2019. And things align. I had this people, this community I wanted to help. I had this idea of what could help, and I also had the material, the gear to actually start a podcast that could bring that message out to people. And that's how it was born. I never thought I'd be like behind a mic in front of a camera, and here we are almost 6 years later and more than 300 episodes later. And it's something until there are no more people out there needing to hear these stories, I just see myself continuing to do this. And there's an aspect that you mentioned that I also feel. It's also fun sometimes to see how the guest takes pleasure in revisiting that time that we talk about, because often they haven't thought about it since then, and they get a chance to take stock of things and sometimes reframe things. Anyway, it's a lot of fun for me. So while it's fun and while it's helping people, I'll keep on doing it.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, I have to say 300 plus episodes is an amazing achievement. And certainly the story behind how Research Adjacent started is very similar. It's like, there's these people I want to help. I know some people who I could get to know. I know how to make podcasts. Let's just do it. That's one of the things about podcasts, isn't it? You can just get on. But those things that you were saying about, coming to do something different after your PhD and starting to think, well, does this make me a failure? Or who am I if I'm not part of this community? They come up so often with people that I speak to, whether it's people who are currently PhD students, whether it's people who've moved on, because some of those feelings can take a long time to process as well. Yeah. So it is really valuable to share those stories and to help to give people, as you say, different people will resonate with different stories. So having all these different examples of people who've done things and done things a different way. So as I say, 300 plus episodes is very impressive for us as we sit on what I think this is going to be about number 70 or something this one when it comes out for me. So over that time, whether it's with the work that you've done around the medical writing, whether it's around the Papa PhD podcast, I always like to invite my guests to tell us about a couple of really nice examples of things you've done that you're really proud of, that you feel have made a difference. What would you like to share?
One thing that's changed for me in the last year or so is that I decided to, well, also, if we go a little bit back, there was COVID, so what I'm going to say was not possible. But because I'm an introvert, I wasn't going to in-person events and accepting invitations like that so much. And since the last year and a half, 2 years, I've started to do so. I say it because from my conversations with graduate students, introversion or awkwardness in social situations is, there's a bunch of them who come to me with those types of questions.
Definitely a thing, yeah.
And I just want to say that decision of, if there's someone interesting, I'm going to go introduce myself and show my interest or appreciation for what they shared. It really has been a game changer for me in terms of opportunities of collaboration, of projects that have come up from that. And I know it's not exactly what you were asking for, but if we're thinking of inspiring the people who are listening, if you're not going and meeting people out there, you may not suspect, what sort of kind of unexpected results and positive impact on your professional, academic, and personal life may come from that. And so one of the things is I have, and of course, I think, actually, I'm sure that having done this exercise of podcasting and of meeting people almost weekly who I don't know and with whom I have an hour of conversation, has helped me kind of develop or strengthen that muscle of extroversion. There's really a before and after, allowing myself and pushing myself to go out and meet people, and it's really had like tangible impact on what Beyond the Thesis is today, but also, what help and what contribution I'm actually able to bring directly to graduate students here in Montreal or Quebec City. It's really been because of this kind of pushing myself out of my comfort zone. So I think it's not exactly a thing.
I think you say that's not answering the
but
question, but I think it's definitely something to be proud of. Yeah, if it's clearly something that you've done that for you was challenging, and it's had these benefits for yourself and for other people, then I think that's a fantastic example of something to be proud of. And it's interesting. I do often say that podcasting is probably the most intense form of networking I've ever done, because it is. It's just like, let's just invite somebody to come and sit in a room with me for an hour and tell me their life story. Yeah. It's a pretty good way to get to know people. So if you need to do more networking, start a podcast
Yeah, definitely. And podcast is a way to go, but it could take other forms. It can be get together with your colleagues, if you're, let's say, in graduate school, and start a seminar series where you invite alumni.
Yeah. That's it. It just gives you that reason to reach out to these people that you want to build a relationship with.
Reason and platform also.
Yeah, great examples. I think one thing that I would love to ask you about is now, you've spoken to not just all the people that you've had as guests on your podcast, but as you say, you now go out and give talks and give advice to students who are currently in that position. What are some of the main pieces of advice that come up, whether it's from your guests or whether it's the sorts of things you now distill and share with people? What advice would you give to people who are just either coming to the end of their PhD or coming out the other side?
I'm going to start with a fairly simple one and frequent, which is the question that comes up is, should I be on LinkedIn? And how pretty should my profile be on LinkedIn? And I would say you'd be surprised how many people from the academic community are on LinkedIn. Academic adjacent, etc. People who have done research and are now either in academia, industry, or government, they are on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
It's easy to learn about them just by seeing their profiles, etc. Also seeing what they post, but then to interact with them, react to what they post, maybe add some value. So my answer to the first question is you should be on LinkedIn.
Yes.
Because the barrier to entry is very low. But you should try to, there's little things. Don't leave the little gray kind of nondescript image for your persona or your icon. If you need to take a selfie and put it there, at least have your face there.
My LinkedIn profile for the last 3 years has been a selfie. So yeah, selfies are
there
okay.
You go. They're okay. They're okay. It's just, so that's one, being on LinkedIn. And then, no pressure. So be there, try to be authentic, try to not be too academic in the way you use it. Learn how to change the way of like presenting what yourself, your experience, etc. Is, of course, there's content out there that kind of teaches you on YouTube, etc. But see whichever profiles inspire you and see, take from each one something that you find cool and use it on yours in your own way. That's one of the big ones.
Yeah.
The other one that's the larger question, let's say, because the answer is not straightforward, is how do I, as a recent PhD, position myself in the job market so that I'm attractive to employers? And it comes in different forms. It can be what do employers seek? Are there jobs for PhDs out there? What are employers looking for in PhDs? And that's a more complex question, of course, because not employers are looking for PhDs. In some domains, of course, if you did a PhD in pharmacology or different, biochemistry, going to R&D in a pharma company is quite straightforward. Also the scientist in a startup is also straightforward. But then there's a host of ecosystems in the job market where there's no straight line, there's no culture or habit of hiring PhDs. When you meet that person, they look at your CV, and then they'll say, so you've done a PhD, why are you here? Yeah. And it gets emotionally complicated because here you are with the highest academic degree that you can get, thinking now all the doors open.
Yeah.
And there's this job posting that you find interesting, but now the person in front of you may say something like, you may be overqualified, or I don't know that I can pay what you want given your degree. I don't know that we can fulfill your salary expectations.
Yeah.
The PhD, it's 3 letters that are the same around the world, PhD, but no PhD as a person and as a job candidate is like the next one. Yeah. We all have different projects. It's not easy for employers who haven't already found, PhDs actually love having them in my team for this or that aspect. It's hard for them to understand how they're going to fit you in. It falls on to us to learn how to tell the story of what we did in a way that they'll say, okay, I understand, and actually I see how you fit.
Yeah.
And that's why I talk about strategic storytelling. When we come out of graduate school, if we haven't done any like 3-minute thesis type things and haven't dipped our toe in the lake of science communication, we tend to be very cold in the way we present our journey because it's very data driven. It's very, it's the way you do in a science conference because you need to actually let the data speak for themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's not the same when you leave academia.
I've certainly done a lot of recruitment. Yeah, I can really resonate. And people who are fresh out of PhDs or who haven't quite got their head around it, they present themselves that it's all about the qualifications and it's all about the publications, and then that should speak for itself. And it doesn't. That's something we could do. Well, maybe we will get into when we turn the tables. But yes, thank you for that. I think both of those really useful pieces of advice. So yeah, get on LinkedIn and think about how to present yourself and your skills in a way that's going to make sense to employers. So yeah, both really useful things, and yeah, definitely stuff that's come up a lot. So to wrap up this part of our conversation, if people want to find out more about you, find the podcast, find anything to do with that, whereabouts would you send them?
you can go to LinkedIn and look for David Mendes, PhD, or Papa PhD. For the podcast, the website of the podcast is papaphd.com. On the site, you'll also find links to Apple Podcasts, Android, etc., all the other platforms where you can listen.
Yeah.
Spotify, look for Papa PhD. You'll find the version just with episodes in French and the original Beyond the Thesis with Papa PhD, where it's bilingual. There's some episodes in French and some in English. So for the podcast, whichever platform you use, plug in Papa PhD or Beyond the Thesis and you'll find it.
You'll find it. And fantastic.
Then, on Instagram, if you're there, and I share some content there, the username is Papa PhD Podcast.
Fantastic. Oh, well, we'll certainly get the links and put them in the show notes as well. So thank you so much for coming along, telling us about your journey and your podcast as well. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this new episode of Season 6 of Beyond the Thesis with Papa PhD. Have a question about this interview? Want to leave a comment about the podcast? Have someone you want to recommend to be interviewed? Go to speakpipe.com/papaphd and leave me a voice note. Just hit the big record button and leave me an up to 90-second message. I listen to all my messages and I consider all of them for feature on future episodes. speakpipe.com/papaphd. Hope to hear from you soon.